During a regular afternoon at the mansion, the billionaire's mischievous triplets notice a strange mark on the new maid's arm. Curious, they ask about the scar. But her answer stuns everyone in the room. The mark is identical to the one the billionaire once described seeing on the arm of the woman who vanished years ago. Taking with her a secret that, before we begin, I want you to know, no matter where you are in the world, I'm happy you're here with us. If you're enjoying this, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel to stay connected. The Georgia sun blazed mercilessly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting long shadows across the Italian marble floors. Sarah Martinez adjusted her long-sleeved blouse for the 100th time that morning, wincing as the fabric brushed against the tender bruises hidden beneath. She'd been the Whitmore family's housekeeper for 3 years now, ever since Richard Whitmore's wife had passed away, leaving him to raise their 6-year-old triplets alone. "Miss Sarah! Miss Sarah!" The familiar chorus of young voices echoed through the grand foyer as 3 identical boys came racing down the curved staircase, their sneakers squeaking against the polished steps. "Careful now," Sarah called out in her gentle voice, though she couldn't help but smile at the sight of them. Michael, Matthew, and Marcus, the Whitmore triplets, had become the light of her life during her time here. Despite their father's cold demeanor and obsession with his business empire, these 3 boys remained pure hearts in a world of luxury and isolation. Michael, always the leader despite being born only minutes before his brothers, skidded to a stop in front of Sarah. His bright blue eyes sparkled with mischief. "We finished our morning lessons early. Can we help you with the garden today?" Sarah's heart warmed. Most children born into such wealth would never think to help with household chores, but these boys were different. Perhaps it was their mother's influence, or maybe just their natural kindness, but they always wanted to be involved in Sarah's daily routines. "Of course, sweethearts," she replied, gently ruffling Michael's dark hair. "But first, let me finish preparing your father's lunch. You know how he gets when his schedule is disrupted." Matthew, the quietest of the 3, stepped forward with a concerned frown. "Miss Sarah, aren't you hot in that long shirt? It's like 100 degrees outside today." Sarah's breath caught slightly. The boys had been asking this question more frequently lately, and each time it became harder to deflect. "I'm fine, honey. I just prefer to keep my arms covered when I'm working in the sun. Protection from UV rays, you know." Marcus, the most observant of the triplets, tilted his head. "But you wear long sleeves even inside, Miss Sarah." "Even in winter, Mum used to say that people should be comfortable in their own skin." The mention of their mother, Eleanor Whitmore, always created a bittersweet moment. Sarah had never met the woman, but from the photos throughout the house and the boys' stories, she seemed to have been everything Richard was not: warm, caring, and genuinely interested in her children's well-being. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise," Sarah said softly, then clapped her hands together to change the subject. "Now, who wants to help me make those special cookies you love so much?" The distraction worked, as it always did. The 3 boys cheered and followed her toward the kitchen, their questions about her clothing temporarily forgotten. But Sarah knew their curiosity was growing, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her secret hidden. As they walked through the mansion's opulent halls, past priceless artwork and furniture that cost more than most people's homes, Sarah couldn't help but think about the stark contrast between this world and the one she returned to each night. The Whitmore mansion was a palace, but it had become a prison of sorts, not just for her, but for these 3 innocent boys who barely saw their father except during formal dinner hours. "Miss Sarah," Michael said as they entered the state-of-the-art kitchen, "do you think Dad will be home for dinner tonight?" Sarah's heart ached at the hopeful tone in his voice. Richard Whitmore was one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta, with business interests spanning across multiple industries. His success had come at a price: complete emotional disconnection from his sons. He provided them with everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. "I'm not sure, sweetheart," she answered honestly. "Your father has a very important business meeting today, but whether he's here or not, we'll make it special, just the four of us." As the boys began pulling ingredients from the pantry, Sarah rolled up her sleeves slightly to begin mixing the cookie dough. The movement was automatic, born from years of cooking and cleaning. She didn't notice Marcus watching her intently from the corner of his eye, or the way his expression changed when he caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong on her usually pristine skin. The kitchen filled with the sound of laughter and chatter as they worked together, creating the kind of warm, family atmosphere that the mansion rarely experienced. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to forget about everything else, her own problems, her fears, the secret she carried. In these moments with the boys, she could almost imagine this was her real life, that she belonged in this world of safety and love. But reality has a way of intruding on even the most perfect moments, and Sarah's secret was about to become much harder to hide. The afternoon heat was becoming unbearable, even with the mansion's industrial air conditioning system running at full capacity. Sarah had moved the boys' activities to the library, a room Richard rarely used, preferring his private office for any work that couldn't be done at his downtown headquarters. The library was Sarah's favorite room in the house, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with classics and children's stories, comfortable reading nooks, and large windows that looked out over the manicured gardens. The triplets were sprawled across the Persian rug, working on a jigsaw puzzle that Elena had apparently started with them before her death. It was a tradition they'd maintained, always having one puzzle in progress, though Sarah noticed they never seemed eager to complete them. Perhaps finishing would mean letting go of another piece of their mother. "Miss Sarah, this piece doesn't fit anywhere," Matthew complained, holding up a small section of what appeared to be blue sky. Sarah was organizing some of the children's books that had been left scattered around the room. As she reached for a high shelf, her sleeve caught on the corner of a picture frame, pulling it up her arm and exposing several inches of her forearm. "Miss Sarah!" Marcus's sharp intake of breath made everyone freeze. Sarah quickly turned around, pulling her sleeve back down, but it was too late. All three boys were staring at her with wide eyes, the puzzle completely forgotten. "What happened to your arm?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's mind raced. She'd been so careful for so long, but one careless moment had undone years of concealment. The bruises on her forearm were particularly dark today, purple and yellow marks that clearly showed the outline of fingers where someone had grabbed her roughly. "It's nothing, boys," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Just a little accident. You know how clumsy I can be sometimes." But Marcus was already standing up, his 6-year-old face showing wisdom beyond his years. He'd always been the most perceptive of the three, the one who noticed details others missed. "Those look like finger marks, Miss Sarah. Someone hurt you." The innocent observation hung in the air like a physical weight. Sarah felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. These children, who had already lost so much, were now being exposed to another harsh reality of the adult world. "Boys, please," Sarah began, but Matthew was already crossing the room toward her. "Let me see," he said with the determination that only a concerned child could muster. "Mom always said we should help people who are hurt." "Yeah," Michael chimed in, abandoning the puzzle completely. "We can get the first aid kit from Dad's bathroom. He has all kinds of fancy medical stuff up there." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. Their immediate instinct was to help, to care for someone they loved. It was exactly what Eleanor would have taught them, and so different from the cold indifference their father showed toward anyone's pain or problems. "Sit down, Miss Sarah," Marcus said, patting the arm of the leather reading chair. "You take care of us all the time. Now it's our turn to take care of you." Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself sinking into the chair. The weight of 3 years of secrecy was finally becoming too much to bear alone. These boys, despite their youth, had shown her more genuine concern in the past 5 minutes than any adult in her life had shown her in months. "Now," Michael said, crossing his arms in a perfect imitation of his father's business pose, "tell us the truth. Who did this to you?" Sarah looked at their 3 expectant faces, so young, yet already showing signs of the men they would become. Michael with his natural leadership qualities, Matthew with his gentle empathy, and Marcus with his sharp intelligence. They deserved better than lies and half-truths. "It's complicated, sweethearts," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Adults always say that when they think kids can't understand," Marcus replied. "But we understand more than you think. We know Dad is sad all the time because Mom died. We know he works so much because he doesn't know how to be around us. And we know you're the only person who really takes care of us." Sarah felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. How had these 6-year-olds developed such emotional intelligence while living in a house where feelings were rarely discussed? "You're right," she said softly. "You do understand more than most adults give you credit for. But this is a grown-up problem, and I don't want you boys to worry about me." "But we already worry about you," Matthew said, climbing onto the arm of her chair. "We notice things too, like how you never eat lunch with us anymore, and how you always park your car where Dad can't see it from his office, and how you never talk about your family or your life outside of here." Sarah's breath caught. They had been paying attention to everything, processing details she thought she'd successfully hidden. The realization was both touching and terrifying. "The person who hurt you," Michael said quietly, "is it someone we know?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications Sarah wasn't ready to address. The truth was more complicated than these innocent children could possibly understand, and revealing it would change their lives in ways she couldn't predict. But looking at their concerned faces, Sarah realized that her silence was already changing them. They were learning to accept secrecy and unexplained pain as normal parts of life. If she continued to hide the truth, she might be teaching them the same emotional detachment that had made their father so cold. "Boys," she said slowly, "what I'm about to tell you might be hard to understand, and you have to promise me that you'll let me handle this situation in my own way. Can you promise me that?" All 3 nodded solemnly, sensing the gravity of the moment. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that once she spoke the words, there would be no going back. Her secret was about to become their burden too, and she only hoped she was making the right choice. "The person who hurt me," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "is someone who should protect me instead." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the library as Sarah struggled with how much to reveal to the 3 young faces looking at her with such trust and concern. She had spent years protecting these boys from harsh realities, and now she was about to introduce them to one of the harshest truths of all. "Miss Sarah," Marcus said gently, "is it your husband?" The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard. She had never mentioned being married to the boys, always referring to her life outside the mansion in vague terms, but children, especially perceptive ones like the Whitmore triplets, pick up on details adults think they've successfully hidden. "How did you—" Sarah began, then stopped herself. Of course they would have noticed. They were bright, observant children who had been watching her carefully for 3 years. "You wear a wedding ring," Matthew pointed out quietly, "but you never talk about your husband like other married people do. And sometimes you come to work with red eyes, like you've been crying. Plus," Michael added, "you never want to leave early or take days off, even when we tell you it's okay. It's like you don't want to go home." Sarah felt a tear roll down her cheek, These 6-year-old boys had demonstrated more emotional intelligence and awareness than most trained counselors. They had been quietly observing and worrying about her while she thought she was protecting them. "You're all very smart," she said, reaching out to touch each of their faces gently. "Too smart for your own good sometimes." "Yes, I'm married. His name is David, and he has problems controlling his anger." "Might..." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth. For 3 years, she had made excuses for David's behavior, rationalized his violence, blamed herself for triggering his rages. Speaking the truth aloud to these children felt both liberating and terrifying. "He hits you," Marcus said matter-of-factly. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The simple acknowledgement felt like lifting a 1,000-pound weight from her shoulders. "That's not okay," Michael said firmly, his young voice filled with righteous anger. "Grown-ups aren't supposed to hurt each other. That's like the first rule of being a grown-up." "Our mom and dad never hit each other," Matthew added. "Even when Dad got stressed about work, he never hurt Mum. He would just go to his office and close the door." "Why don't you leave him?" Marcus asked with the blunt honesty that only children possess. It was the question Sarah had asked herself 1,000 times, the question that kept her awake at night and haunted her during the day. How could she explain the complex web of fear, financial dependence, and psychological manipulation that kept her trapped in an abusive marriage? "It's not that simple, sweetheart," she said slowly. "David controls all our money. This job is the only income I have that he doesn't know about. If I tried to leave, I wouldn't have anywhere to go, no way to support myself." "You could stay here," Michael announced as if the solution was obvious. "We have like 50 empty bedrooms. Dad would never even notice." Sarah couldn't help but smile at his innocent logic, even as her heart broke a little more. "Your father has been very kind to give me this job, but I don't think he would want his housekeeper living in his house permanently." "Why not ask him?" Matthew suggested. "Maybe he would understand. Maybe he would help you." The idea of approaching Richard Whitmore about her personal problems seemed impossible to Sarah. The man barely acknowledged her existence beyond giving instructions about household management. He was polite, but distant, treating her more like a piece of efficient equipment than a human being with feelings and problems. "Your father has enough to worry about with his business and taking care of you boys," Sarah said diplomatically. "This is my problem to solve." "But you don't have to solve it alone," Marcus insisted. "That's what families do. They help each other, and you're family to us, Miss Sarah. You're more like our mom than anyone else has been since she died." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had tried so hard to maintain professional boundaries, to remember that this was just a job, that these weren't her children to love and protect. But somewhere along the way, they had become her family in every way that mattered. "Boys," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you can't tell anyone about this conversation. Not your father, not your teachers, not anyone. Do you understand? If David finds out that I told someone about our problems, he might hurt me even worse." The 3 boys exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them having one of their silent communications that twins and triplets sometimes develop. Finally, Michael spoke for all of them. "We promise we won't tell anyone," he said solemnly. "But, Miss Sarah, we want to help you. There has to be something we can do." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the driveway. Through the library windows, they could see Richard Whitmore's black Mercedes pulling up to the front entrance, hours earlier than his usual arrival time. "He's home early," Matthew observed, and Sarah could hear the mixture of excitement and nervousness in his voice. The boys always hoped for more time with their father, but his early returns often meant he was in a particularly foul mood about business matters. Sarah quickly pulled her sleeves down and stood up, smoothing her hair and trying to compose herself. "Remember what you promised," she whispered to the boys. "This conversation stays between us." As footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, Sarah realized that her secret was now shared with the three people who mattered most to her in the world. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel completely alone with her pain, but she also knew that involving the boys in her problems might have consequences she couldn't foresee. And with Richard Whitmore about to walk through the library door, those consequences might be starting sooner than she expected. The heavy oak door swung open, and Richard Whitmore stepped into the library, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his face wearing an expression Sarah had never seen before. Something had happened at his office, something significant enough to bring him home in the middle of the afternoon. "Boys," he said, his voice strangely strained, "I need to speak with Miss Sarah privately." The three boys exchanged worried glances as their father's unusual request hung in the air. In all their years, Richard Whitmore had never asked to speak privately with any household staff. His interactions with Sarah were typically limited to brief, formal exchanges about schedules and household needs. "Dad, we were just working on our puzzle," Michael said, instinctively moving closer to Sarah. "Can't we stay?" "No," Richard replied firmly, though his tone lacked its usual edge. "This is important. Go to your rooms and work on your afternoon studies. I'll speak with you later." Sarah's heart began racing. Had Richard somehow discovered her secret? Had someone seen the bruises and reported back to him? The fear of losing this job, her only source of independence, threatened to overwhelm her. "It's okay, boys," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Go ahead, I'll come check on you in a little while." Reluctantly, the triplets filed out of the library, but not before each one gave Sarah a reassuring look. Their silent support gave her strength as she faced whatever Richard Whitmore needed to discuss. Once the door closed behind them, Richard moved to the large windows overlooking the gardens. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared out at the perfectly manicured landscape that he paid a small fortune to maintain, but rarely took time to enjoy. "Miss Martinez," he finally began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, "I received some disturbing information today." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Somehow he had found out about David, about the abuse, about her lies and secrets. She would lose this job, lose the boys who had become her whole world, lose the only safe haven she had. "Sir, I can explain," she started, but Richard held up his hand. "Please, let me finish." He turned to face her, and Sarah was shocked to see something she had never witnessed before in Richard Whitmore's eyes: genuine concern. "I had a meeting today with Detective Morrison from the Atlanta Police Department. It seems there's been an investigation into domestic violence cases in our area, and your husband's name came up." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the back of the reading chair to steady herself, her mind reeling with the implications. "They've been building a case," Richard continued, his voice gentle but serious. "Apparently neighbors have reported sounds of violence from your apartment multiple times over the past year. Hospital records show you've been treated for accidents with suspicious frequency. A pattern has emerged." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. The secret she had worked so desperately to keep hidden was already known to people she had never met, documented in official reports, discussed in police meetings. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How do you know Detective Morrison? Why would he tell you about this?" Richard moved closer, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Because, Miss Martinez, I asked him to look into it." The confession hung between them, like a live wire. Sarah stared at him in shock, trying to process what he had just said. "You asked him to investigate my husband?" she managed to say. "I asked him to investigate the situation," Richard corrected. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I'm not blind. I've been watching you for months, noticing things, the way you flinch when doors slam, how you always wear long sleeves, the fact that you never take sick days, even when you're clearly in pain, the way you park your car out of sight from my office windows." Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank into the chair behind her. Richard Whitmore, the cold, distant businessman who barely seemed to notice his own children, had been observing her with the attention of a trained investigator. "The boys mentioned that you notice things too," she said weakly. "The boys?" Richard's eyebrows rose. "What did they say?" Sarah realized she had just revealed the conversation she had promised to keep secret. But given the circumstances, perhaps honesty was the only way forward. "They saw the bruises today," she admitted. "They asked questions, and I told them the truth, about David, about why I can't leave." Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with an emotion Sarah had never heard from him before. Regret. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I'm sorry that you've been suffering in silence while working in my home. I'm sorry that my sons discovered this burden before I took action to help you. And I'm sorry that I've been so disconnected from what happens in my own house, that I failed to protect someone who has been protecting my children." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. The relief of having her secret finally out in the open was overwhelming, but so was the fear of what would happen next. "What does this mean?" she asked. "Will I lose my job? Will David find out that you know?" "Lose your job?" Richard looked genuinely surprised. "Sarah, you're not going anywhere. In fact, I have a proposition for you." He moved to his briefcase, which Sarah now noticed he had brought into the library with him, and pulled out a thick folder. "Detective Morrison has enough evidence to arrest David tonight," he said, opening the folder to reveal police reports, hospital records, and photographs that made Sarah's stomach turn. "But they need your cooperation to make the charges stick. They need you to testify about what he's done to you." Sarah's mind raced. The idea of facing David in a courtroom, of publicly admitting to the abuse she had hidden for so long, was terrifying. But the alternative, continuing to live in fear, continuing to hide bruises from the children she loved, seemed even worse. "What happens if I testify?" she asked. "David goes to prison," Richard said matter-of-factly. "And you stay here with us for as long as you want, not just as an employee, Sarah, as family." The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities Sarah had never dared to imagine. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Richard continued, settling into the chair across from her. "About Elena, about what she would say if she could see how I've been raising our boys. She would be disappointed in me, I think. She would tell me that I've been so focused on providing financial security that I've forgotten to provide emotional security." Sarah wiped her eyes, seeing Richard Whitmore clearly for the first time since she had known him. "The boys talk about her all the time," Sarah said softly. "They remember her love, her warmth. They're good boys, Mr. Whitmore. They have huge hearts and incredible empathy. She would be proud of who they're becoming." "Thanks to you," Richard said. "You've been the mother figure they needed when I was too broken to be the father they deserved. The least I can do is help you escape from a situation that's been breaking you." A knock at the library door interrupted them. Michael's voice called out from the hallway. "Dad? Miss Sarah? Is everything okay? We've been waiting for like an hour." Richard and Sarah looked at each other, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, Richard Whitmore smiled. Really smiled, not the polite, business-appropriate expression he usually wore. "I think," he said, "it's time we told them that everything is going to be more than okay." Udo. The next morning brought attention to the Whitmore mansion that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Sarah had spent the night in one of the guest bedrooms, the first time she hadn't returned to the apartment she shared with David in over 3 years. Richard had insisted, and Detective Morrison had agreed that it was safer for her to stay at the mansion until David was in custody. The boys had been told that Miss Sarah would be staying with them for a while, and their excitement was palpable. They had spent the evening showing her every corner of the house she had never seen during her working hours, secret passages between rooms, a hidden library nook where Elena used to read to them, and a rooftop garden that Richard had built but never visited. Now, as morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, Sarah was preparing breakfast with 3 eager helpers who seemed determined to make this the best morning of her life. They had no idea that in a few hours their world would change dramatically. "Miss Sarah," Matthew said as he carefully arranged orange slices on a plate, "are you going to live with us forever now?" The innocent question hit Sarah harder than she expected. Forever. Such a simple concept for a child, so complicated for an adult who had learned that nothing good ever lasted. "I don't know about forever, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but I'm here now, and that's what matters." "Dad seems different," Marcus observed, his sharp eyes missing nothing as usual. "He actually ate dinner with us last night, and he asked us about our day, like really asked, not just the polite questions." Sarah had noticed the change too. Richard Whitmore had spent the previous evening truly engaging with his sons for the first time since she had known him. He had listened to their stories, laughed at their jokes, and even joined them for their bedtime ritual of reading together. "People can change," Sarah said carefully. "Sometimes it just takes the right circumstances to help them remember what's important." "Is that what happened to you too?" Michael asked. "Did something change to make you remember you could stay with people who love you?" The wisdom in his 6-year-old question took Sarah's breath away. These boys understood so much more than the adults in their lives gave them credit for. Before Sarah could answer, Richard entered the kitchen, fully dressed for business, but moving with less urgency than usual. In his hand was his cell phone, and Sarah could tell from his expression that he had received important news. "Boys," he said, "I need to speak with Miss Sarah for a moment. Can you finish setting the table for breakfast?" The triplets nodded, though Sarah could see the worry in their eyes. After yesterday's dramatic events, they were hyper-aware of any private conversations between adults. Richard led Sarah into the adjacent breakfast nook, far enough from the boys to speak privately, but close enough to keep them in sight. "Detective Morrison called," he said quietly. "They arrested David an hour ago at his construction site. He's in custody, and they formally charged him with aggravated assault and domestic violence." Sarah felt her knees go weak. After 3 years of living in fear, it was over. David was behind bars, unable to hurt her, unable to track her down, unable to drag her back into the nightmare her life had become. "How do you feel?" Richard asked, studying her face carefully. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. Relief, terror, guilt, all at the same time. "Is that normal?" "From what Detective Morrison told me, it's very normal," Richard assured her. "Leaving an abusive relationship is complicated, even when you have help. There's no right way to feel." Sarah nodded, then looked back toward the kitchen where the boys were chattering as they worked. "What do we tell them?" "The truth," Richard said simply. "Age-appropriate truth, but truth nonetheless. They're already involved, and they deserve to understand what's happening." "Dad! Miss Sarah!" Michael called from the kitchen. "Breakfast is ready!" As they returned to the kitchen, Sarah was amazed by what the boys had accomplished. The table was set with the good china. Fresh flowers had been arranged in a vase, and they had somehow managed to prepare fresh orange juice and perfectly toasted bread to accompany the eggs and bacon Sarah had started. "This is beautiful," she said, genuinely touched by their effort. "We wanted to make it special," Matthew explained, "since it's your first real breakfast living here." As they settled around the table, Richard taking his place at the head for the first time in months, Sarah to his right, and the boys arranged across from them, The scene felt surreal. This was what family breakfast looked like, what Sarah had dreamed of but never experienced in her own childhood or marriage. "Boys," Richard began, cutting into his eggs with deliberate care, "Miss Sarah and I have something important to tell you." 3 pairs of blue eyes looked up expectantly, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. "You know how we talked yesterday about Miss Sarah's husband hurting her?" Richard continued. "Well, the police arrested him this morning. He can't hurt her anymore." Marcus was the first to react, setting down his fork and breaking into a huge grin. "Really? He's in jail?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "He's going to stay there for a long time." "Good!" Michael declared with the fierce protectiveness that had always characterized him. "People who hurt other people should go to jail." "What happens now?" Matthew asked, always the one to worry about details and next steps. Richard and Sarah exchanged glances. They had discussed this possibility during their long conversation the night before, but saying it out loud would make it real. "Well," Richard said slowly, "I've asked Miss Sarah if she would like to stay here permanently, not just as our housekeeper, but as part of our family." And the kitchen erupted in cheers from the 3 boys, but Sarah held up her hand for quiet. "There's something else you need to know," she said. "Because David hurt me, I have to go to court and tell a judge about what happened. It might be scary, and it might take a long time. Are you okay with that?" "You okay with—" "We'll be there with you," Marcus said immediately. "Right, Dad." Richard looked at his youngest son, technically youngest by 3 minutes, but often the most mature of the 3, and felt something shift in his chest. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. "Right," he said firmly. "We'll be there with you every step of the way." As breakfast continued, filled with excited chatter about room arrangements and new family traditions, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Real, tangible hope for a future free from fear. But in the back of her mind, she knew that David's arrest was just the beginning. The real challenge would be rebuilding her life and learning to trust that this happiness was real and permanent. What she didn't know was that the biggest surprise was yet to come, and it would change everything she thought she knew about the Whitmore family. 3 months later, the Whitmore mansion had been transformed into something Eleanor would have recognized. A real home filled with laughter, warmth, and the controlled chaos that comes with 3 energetic 6-year-olds and the adults who love them. Sarah had officially moved into the guest wing, which Richard had renovated to create a private suite for her. More importantly, she had become the boys' legal guardian alongside Richard. A process that had been surprisingly swift given Richard's influence and the boys' enthusiastic testimony about wanting Sarah to be their official mum. The court case against David had concluded 2 weeks earlier. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison, with a restraining order that would remain in effect indefinitely. Sarah had testified with courage that amazed everyone who knew her story, and the boys had been there in the courtroom gallery holding signs that read, "We love you, Miss Sarah," in their careful 6-year-old handwriting. But today was special for a different reason. Today was the boys' 7th birthday, and it was the first birthday celebration in the mansion since Eleanor's death 4 years earlier. "Miss Sarah, Miss Sarah." The familiar chorus echoed through the house, but now it carried pure joy instead of the underlying sadness that had characterized their voices for so long. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, where she had been putting finishing touches on 3 identical chocolate cakes, one for each boy, as had apparently been Elena's tradition. She was wearing a blue dress that Richard had bought for her, the first new clothes she had owned in years that weren't designed to hide bruises. "What's all the excitement?" she asked, though she was smiling broadly. "Dad says we have to wait until after cake for our big surprise," Michael announced, practically bouncing with anticipation. "But we think we know what it is," Marcus added with a knowing grin. Matthew, still the quietest but no longer the most worried of the three, just smiled and took Sarah's hand. We love you, Miss Sarah, even if your last name is going to change. Sarah's breath caught. The boys had figured it out, just as they figured out everything else in their perceptive way. What do you mean, my last name is going to change? She asked, though her heart was already racing. Dad's been acting weird for weeks, Michael explained. Happy weird, but weird. And he keeps making phone calls and leaving the room. Plus, he bought you that pretty dress and told us to wear our good clothes today. And yesterday, we saw him hiding a small box in his desk drawer, Marcus added matter-of-factly. Sarah looked toward the kitchen doorway, where Richard was standing, with an expression of mock exasperation and genuine amusement. I should have known I couldn't keep anything secret from you three, he said, walking into the room. You're too smart for your own good. Over the past 3 months, Richard had undergone a transformation that was nothing short of miraculous. Therapy, both individual and family, had helped him process his grief over Elena's death and his guilt over neglecting his sons. He had restructured his business to allow for more time at home, and he had slowly but surely fallen in love with the woman who had saved his family in every way that mattered. So, Marcus said, crossing his arms in a perfect imitation of his father's business pose, are you going to ask her to marry you or not? Richard laughed, a sound that had become increasingly common in the Whitmore household. Well, since you've all figured it out anyway. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, dropping to one knee right there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by birthday decorations and 3 excited little boys. Sarah Martinez, he said, opening the box to reveal a beautiful but simple diamond ring. You saved my sons when I couldn't save myself. You brought love back into this house when I thought it was gone forever. You showed me what it means to be a real father and a real man. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as Richard continued. I know this might seem fast, and I know our situation is unconventional, but I also know that life is unpredictable, and when you find something real and good and pure, you don't let it go. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and their mother, officially and forever? The room was completely silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet crying. The 3 boys watched with wide eyes, barely breathing, as they waited for her answer. Yes, Sarah whispered. Then louder, yes, of course, yes. The room erupted in cheers as Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, and the boys rushed forward to engulf them both in a group hug that nearly knocked them over. Does this mean we can call you Mom now? Matthew asked, his voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. If you want to, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. But only if you want to. We want to, all 3 boys said in unison, and Sarah's heart felt like it might burst from happiness. As the celebration continued around them, Richard caught Sarah's eye over the boys' heads. In his gaze, she saw everything she had never dared to hope for. Love, security, family, and a future free from fear. Happy birthday, boys, she said, looking at each of their shining faces, and thank you for the best gift you could ever give me. What gift? Marcus asked, confused. A family, Sarah replied simply. You gave me a family. Later that evening, after cake and presents and more excitement than the mansion had seen in years, Sarah stood in the doorway of the boys' room, watching Richard read them their bedtime story. It was a scene she had observed hundreds of times as their housekeeper, but now she was watching as their mother and Richard's fiancée. Miss Sarah, Mom, Michael called softly from his bed. Will you come sit with us? Sarah joined them, settling between Matthew and Marcus, while Michael scooted closer to his father. As Richard continued reading, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been trapped in an abusive marriage, hiding bruises and living in constant fear. The boys had been growing up without emotional connection to their father, learning to accept coldness and distance as normal. Now they were a real family, imperfect and healing, but real nonetheless. The boys had learned that adults could change, that love was stronger than fear, and that sometimes the most broken people could become the most beautiful families. And Sarah had learned that she was worthy of love, worthy of protection, and worthy of a happy ending that she had never believed possible. As Richard closed the book and began tucking each boy into bed, Sarah realized that this wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning, the first chapter of a story that would be written by 4 people who had found each other when they needed it most. "Good night, boys," Richard said, kissing each forehead. "Good night, Mom," they chorused, and Sarah's heart soared. "Good night, my beautiful boys," she replied. "I love you more than all the stars in the sky." As they left the room and closed the door, Richard took Sarah's hand, and she marveled at how different it felt to be touched with love instead of violence. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Sarah looked back toward the boys' room, then at the ring on her finger, then into the eyes of the man who had helped her believe in happy endings again. "Only one," she said with a smile, "that it took us so long to become a family." Outside, the Georgia stars shone down on the Whitmore mansion, where 4 people who had been broken by life had found a way to heal each other and create something beautiful from the pieces. And in their beds, 3 7-year-old boys fell asleep, knowing that they were loved, protected, and part of a real family at last.